Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Grow Podcast. My name is David. I am here with Pastor Mike, as always. Hello, Pastor Mike.
Hello, David.
Welcome to episode 40 of the Grow Podcast.
Episode 40. We have a regular listener who happens to be your dad who is really excited about the fact that we're going to say something profound about the fact that it's 40.
And then I said, should we tell the next part of the story?
Go for it.
I said, it's a biblical number. And Pastor Mike goes, where is 40 in the Bible? And I got real concerned for a moment.
Everybody, you can all log off because I obviously do not know my Bible. Yeah,
he picked it up pretty quick, but it started, it was a weird start.
I confessed, I'm on cold medicine today, so... Yes. That I'm a little fuzzy. So this could be interesting. You're going to do most of the
that's a terrible
today.
idea.
Yeah.
I did. So it is episode 40. We're 10 away from 50, which seems like we should do something fun for episode 50. Maybe we'll work on something for that.
We've been asking all along for questions that people would like. I'm actually in a few weeks here. I'm doing a Q&A session with our students on our Williston campus, and they're going to ask me any question they want. So if you don't give me questions, we'll use their questions. And
send your questions in. You can either send them to me if you don't want Pastor Mike to know the question in advance.
That would be frightening.
That's David@newhopewilliston.com. David spelled D-A-V-E-D. Or you can send it to pastor.mike@newhopewilliston.com. But then he might know the question in advance. So that's really up to you. I had a request.
Yes.
From a couple of our regular listeners. They want you to do a daily episode of the Grow Podcast.
No.
So I think if we get 15 people that send an email saying they want a daily podcast, we will try to come up with a way to do one more episode a week, even though it won't be a full podcast episode. It might just be me logging on and saying, hello, I hope you have a great day today. But we'll need a little more demand. But
I might be able to do those from a padded room, the amount of time.
Well, shout out to Crystal and Teresa, our friends, because they were the ones who requested the daily podcast. And if you joined us this weekend, you got to hear their story.
Part of their story.
They're pretry cool people, and so I'm glad that all of our different campuses got to meet them.
Keep checking. I believe they're kind of a fuller version of their story because their story is pretty amazing. Both of them will show up on New Hope here in the next few weeks.
A longer version that goes up on our YouTube channel. Where you may be joining us right now.
Yeah.
And if you're not and you only listen to the audio podcast, you can always find the video podcast on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/newhopehere. And make sure you subscribe so you get notified when the new episodes go up. People are really liking the worship songs that we're putting up by our incredible worship team. You and I are not invited to sing or play instruments on those days, and that's why they're so good.
We're behind the camera.
Yes. Yeah. That's been really cool. Make sure you check that out if you haven't yet. But let's dive into our podcast here, Pastor Mike. We've been still in this series, My Story Matters, and on our weekend teaching, and you've been teaching us about what Jesus said to ordinary people just like us. And so this weekend, you went into the story of when the Pharisee, Simon, invited Jesus over. Pharisees being the fancy pants teachers of the law back in the day.
That's a good definition
of
it. Yeah.
In my paraphrase version of the Bible, that is what they will be called. The fancy pants teacher of the law, Simon, had Jesus over. And then we don't have a name for the woman, right?
She's called in the Bible is the immoral woman. Can you imagine? For all of history, you're known as the immoral woman in the Bible.
And yet her legacy ends up being incredible because of that, because, he obviously looked great to those who just were looking at the outside. He's this fancy pants teacher of the law, and she's an immoral woman. She seems like a sinner. He calls her a sinner, I believe. Simon does. And yet Jesus embraced the immoral woman because of what she was doing and the love she was showing, and kind of rebuked Simon. So that's kind of what we taught on this weekend. And so we're going to talk today about how to know if we have a hard heart.
Well, and one of the reasons I want to talk about it today is because there's a statement I made in the weekend teaching that actually is, for me, it's one of the, if I can say it this way, one of the scariest kind of learnings from this. And I just kind of touched on it this weekend, and I want to go deeper on it. Here's what I said in the weekend teaching. I said, we learned from Simon, I can be in the presence of Jesus and miss how desperate I really am for his love and forgiveness. Yeah. And if I can put that in a little bit different way, I can believe in Jesus. I can even be trying to do everything right, and my heart can still be hard.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how that can happen. The reason I want to teach on this is because I've experienced this. It's a little bit like, we live in North Dakota, and you're from Minnesota, in this part of the world.
State in the union. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that commercial. In this part of the world, things can freeze like that, but most time, it freezes things can freeze kind of slowly. Sure. And all of a sudden you look outside and it's like, oh, everything is frozen over. Yeah. And that can happen with our heart, is we don't even realize it's happening. And that's so much what we talk about in the Grow podcast, is being aware of things that can creep in that we don't even realize happening. And certainly a hard heart.
Do you want to explain to us what that even means? Like, what is that? It sounds like a medical condition that I don't want.
It kind of, I actually Googled it because I was trying to figure out what the best way to describe this would be, and all I got was medical conditions.
I had baklava with my lunch today. If I had 2 pieces of baklava, would I get a hard heart from that? I feel like I'm concerned now.
We could list a bunch of symptoms of hard heart, and the Bible talks about it, like no compassion, being distracted, focusing on the wrong things, arrogance, narcissism, consumerism. But really at the core, when we talk about kind of in our terms, hard-heartedness, those are symptoms. But what hard heart is, for me, it's a lack of sensitivity and responsiveness to God's Spirit. I'm just not responsive to him, and I'm not sensitive to him. In other words, I can even be trying to do the right things. And this was Simon. Simon was a Pharisee, and the Pharisees looked good. They were and we're so hard on them, and Jesus was hard on them and let me say, what we miss in being so hard on them is, in a lot of our circles today, we would say, oh, they're good church people.
Sure.
Because they would be there every week. Yeah. They would be giving they might be serving every week and whatever. Yeah. But everything was exterior. Sure. And there was no sensitivity to the Lord's leading and not hearing his voice. Mark chapter 8, Jesus asks his disciples why they're so obsessed with food. And it's like, we're worried about feeding people. We're worried about where our food's going to come from. And he says this, are your hearts hard? And when your heart's hard, he goes on to say, you can't understand what God is doing or saying. And that, scare is the wrong word for me. I think but I've tried to come up with a better word for it. Maybe you can help me, David, in your vocabulary. It's something we need to be constantly on guard for and aware of, and how easily we can slip into hard-heartedness. I was just reading this week I know everybody's favorite book of the Bible, Deuteronomy.
A classic.
Everybody reads that. Just got done with Numbers, and Leviticus. And one of the things, because Moses is repeating the law in Deuteronomy before they go to the Promised Land, and the big thing he keeps repeating is this thing, and we see it in the Old Testament, of make no image of God. Make no image of God. God did not appear before you in any kind of form. Make no image of God. And as I was digging into that and reflecting on that in my own prayer time, the natural drift for all of us is to do what? Is to make images of spirituality. I want a list that I can measure myself against. And that's part of what happens with hard-heartedness is we turn this into a list, and it's no longer a relationship. It's a little bit like, both you and I are married to, you have an incredible wife, I've got an incredible wife, and if we were to just say every night, I did 10 things, see, you can tell I love you, babe, where's the relationship in that? And they said, but you don't love me. And we're saying, but I did the 10 things. There's no sensitivity. Sure. There's no compassion.
When I hear the phrase hard heart or whatever, I so often think of ancient Egypt, that the Israelites are enslaved and the plagues are happening, and the Bible tells us that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And so, like, jokingly, I want to ask, like, can that just be my excuse every time my heart is hardened? I'm like, well, clearly God hardened it to teach somebody else a lesson. But in a more genuine manner, is that a thing that happens? Is God going to harden my heart to Him at some point? And how do I?
And it says that in Exodus. Paul repeats it in some of his writings, in particular in Romans in the New Testament. And there's a lot of scholars on both sides of this issue. And, we can I don't want to get into the deep theological weeds on this, because it gets into the idea of, does God predetermine our choices or do we have free will? It's really what it comes down to.
You have like 10 minutes if you want to solve that theological question for us.
I believe and am convinced that Scripture is very clear that we have free will, and I think it teaches that very clearly. So if that's the case, then God did not make the choice for Pharaoh to harden his heart. It's the consequence of that. In fact, if you join us for our Easter weekend, or if maybe you're listening to this after Easter weekend, I even talk a little bit about the difference between punishment and consequence. And often the way it's translated is it sounds like a punishment, like God punishes Pharaoh, or God does this to Pharaoh, instead of saying, this is really what it's saying is Pharaoh made choices. And his heart was hardened. And we tend to read it as God did that to him. But in reality, this was his hard heart. And God knew, certainly is aware of our choices, which is another discussion for another time.
So what happens to our heart when it gets hard?
It can happen so slowly, but we talked about it. We lose a sense of compassion. We begin to be distracted. Our emotions can kind of die off. The Bible teaches us, and I'm going to give us a bunch of scriptures here.
Okay.
John chapter 14, it talks about the fact that grief is part of our human experience. And we experience that in our heart. Desires in Matthew 5:28 are part of our heart. Ephesians 5:19 talks about joy. We talked a few minutes ago about understanding. Isaiah 6:10, Matthew 13:15 say our understanding of spiritual things happens in our heart. Thoughts and reasoning in Genesis 6, Hebrews 4, Mark 2. Faith happens in our heart. And the Bible often separates out, but still overlaps, spirit and our mind, spirit and our mind, and it uses the word soul, or psyche is kind of our mind. It's the seat of our thinking and our spirit, and yet they're deeply interconnected. And often when we talk about the heart, it's both of those things combined. It's not just my mind, it's not just my spirit, like those things could be separate, but we tend to talk about them separately. It's the seat of who we are, and it's the seat of our spirit is what it comes down to. So when our heart gets hard, grief, desires, joy, understanding, thoughts, reasoning, faith, those things are all products of the heart, and those products cease to be produced is really what happens in us.
So we said we were going to talk about how to know if I have a hard heart. So we've kind of talked about what that is, what it means, what it might look like. How do we you used the analogy of kind of a slow freeze, right? Yeah. And so how do we identify it before we get to that deep freeze moment where, oh man, we might be too late here?
Some of the great writers and thinkers and spiritual, if I can put it this way, spiritual coaches down through the centuries. In fact, most of them say one of the best ways to guard your heart against things like your heart getting hard or whatever it is to, on a regular basis, ask reflection questions of yourself, ask them of the Holy Spirit, and ask other people around you. And so what I want to do, and we aren't necessarily going to unpack all of these. If there's any you think I need to stop on, that maybe I'm not explaining well, stop me. But I've put together kind of 8 questions, and honestly, some of these questions are new to me that in my research for this, I thought, I need to add that to some of my own reflection questions. So 8 questions that can help you begin to identify. Here's the first one, is what do I talk about most? And ask the people who are closest to you this question, because the Bible says that what comes out of our mouth is the overflow of the what? It's the overflow of the heart. So is most of what's happening and coming out of my mouth negative? Because that reveals what's happening in the heart. Is it shallow? Okay. What I talk about reveals what my heart is soft towards. So that's the first one. What do I talk about most? The second one, am I increasingly indifferent or increasingly saying, I just really don't care? And this is kind of in general. But if I find myself saying that, it means my emotions are becoming detached. Now, some of us are more emotionally sensitive than others. That's not what I'm talking about. But if I'm not celebrating when I need to be celebrating, if not mourning, if I find myself saying things like, it just is what it is, which, by the way, is not a real biblical statement, But pay attention to the seat of your emotions.
What if... let's create a fictional human being. Let's say he's in his mid-60s. He's extremely Swedish. Maybe he's a pastor in Minnesota.
That's very specific.
Yeah, just off the top of my head. Hey, Dad. So someone like myself, I'm a much more emotional person than my father is, for instance. And I never got to meet his dad, but from what I understand, his dad was full on Swede, just, no outward emotions at all. If I'm that type of person, then how do I differentiate between just like, I'm not an overly emotional person. Like I don't get super excited, or my father-in-law is that way. He doesn't get super upset or super excited about things outwardly most of the time. How do you differentiate just the normal Scandinavianness versus that sign of a heart hardening?
I think there's a couple different things. One, we need to understand the difference between expressions of emotion and experience of emotions.
Sure.
So we all express emotions differently. My wife and I express them entirely differently. She's a storyteller. She's got a story for everything and very expressive, and will express them much more intensely than I do. I experience emotions very intensely. I just don't express them. So part of that is being able to identify the difference. Now, if I'm asking the question, and the reality of it is, my emotions are detached, and I've got a good friend of mine who is in his 60s, early 70s now, and he's realized for the last 20 years he's just detached all of his emotions. Well, the Holy Spirit speaks emotionally to us, and it's like detaching an arm. We can still survive, but not as healthy. And so we need to pay attention to the experience of emotions.
Okay. That makes sense.
The next one is kind of connected to it. Question number 3: am I becoming more cynical?
Now let's tell a story about the son of that 65 guy.
Let's talk about you. But part of what that means is, am I increasing? So what you're measuring here is, am I increasing or decreasing in this? So over the last 90 days, over the last 12 months, a lot of times there's some of these questions, reflection questions. These are some of them. I'll go through once a year. Or some of them I'll ask people around me, is this more or less than last year? So am I finding it harder to trust people? And I'm not just people out there, but people who are closer to me, or believe the best in people, And the next one really is another relational question. Am I easily offended or resentful? Am I hanging on to bitterness? Because, and Hebrews talks about this in Hebrews 12, pay attention to the root of bitterness so that it doesn't spring up and defile many. It really can. And you see a lot of these are connected to that heart emotion kind of thing. Is getting passionate or excited hard to come by? I knew something was wrong with me a few years ago when I was, and some of this was just because some things were messed up in me. I would watch a TV show and find myself tearing up. And then I would, later that day or the next day, I would be praying with someone who's in need and find myself going, I need to go. I'm going, oh, okay, something's messed up here. What gets me excited? Is it the things of God or not the things of God? Question number 6, is it increasingly easy to find other things to do instead of spending time with the Lord in the church? Now, it's always, for a lot of us, easier.
Increasingly was the important word.
Increasingly is the easy thing.
Sure.
I had a conversation with someone frequently who actually, I listened to this recently, who realized, our attendance patterns have changed and we didn't even realize it. Where we used to just be regular. It's like, we're busy, and suddenly we aren't even worshiping, and it's like once every 6 or 7 weeks now. We just hadn't thought about it because life just happened. And they realized, and it's starting to affect us. We're becoming detached from those things. Question number 7, are any of my relationships, especially my relationship with God, feeling mechanical?
Just going through the motions.
Yeah. Whatever we need to do, And question number 8, am I increasingly concerned about looking right? Looking right. Am I, one of the phrases for me, and I'm going to reveal part of me that I haven't revealed to too many people. We all have one or two desires that sin has twisted in all of us that poke to the surface and have potential to poison us. One of those with me in the past, and can still, it's a little bit like an alcoholic. Once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. You may not have touched it. Is this phrase, to be known. So for me, it's isn't a pride thing. There was a time when I wanted to be known as, and you can fill in the blanks, different things. And so I had to pay attention to, I was working hard to look a certain way so that to you, I would be known as. And what the last part of the sentence was, varied from time to time.
That's not the important part.
To be known as the person who had the answer, to be known as, even, this is irony in its best, to be known as a compassionate person. And so I found myself, without even realizing, pretending to be compassionate. Which meant my heart was hardened because I was so busy trying to look right. So, and there's tons of other questions, but these are some 8 questions that I don't think they're one-off questions. I think these are repeating questions we need to come back to guard our hearts for us.
I think too, when you going back to the weekend teaching with Simon and the immoral woman, it wasn't that Jesus said because she was being loving and wasn't having a hard heart in that moment. It was okay, the things she was doing. He said her sins were forgiven. And that's so different than it's not that he didn't okay. Well, she's washing my feet right now, so it's cool. No, the sins existed. She's just forgiven for them because as she went through that list, kind of that we just went through, she would have probably had a pretty good, if we were scoring it, a pretty good score on those 8 questions. Whereas Simon, who looked, that question number 8 would not have been a great one for most of the Pharisees, it seems, and Simon in this case. And so I think that that's the important thing here too, is where today wasn't about just ask these questions, as long as you're doing good, everything's fine. It's no. We still have to be forgiven for our sins and try to better ourselves in those ways. But here's how today we're specifically talking about, how do I know if I have a hard heart, and how do I avoid
Jesus
that?
In that teaching gives us the first and the major step, if we recognize we have a hard heart, to begin to soften it. It's to begin to reflect on how much you've been forgiven. He said those who have been forgiven much, and I'm going to put in my words, understand this. Their hearts are softer. So to begin to reflect on how much you've been forgiven, that's a major step. Will begin to soften your heart. If the answer to these questions is, is increasingly, oh, my heart is going hard.
Yeah.
Start there and begin to list, I've been forgiven for this.
Let me, I assume our homework for the day is these questions.
Yep.
Okay. So I'm going to read them off just at the end of the podcast here, so you don't have to go through to get to your homework. So there's 8 questions. First question, what do I talk about most? Is it positive or negative? Mm-hmm. And obviously we went deeper into all of these, but question number 2, am I indifferent or increasingly saying I just don't really care? Number 3, am I becoming more cynical? Number 4, am I easily offended or resentful? Number 5, is getting passionate or excited hard to come by? Number 6, is it increasingly easy to find other things to do instead of spending time with the Lord and the church? Number 7, are any of my relationships, especially my relationship with God, feeling mechanical? And then number 8 that we just covered was, am I increasingly concerned about looking right? Thank you, Pastor Mike. This was a really cool podcast. I really appreciated it. Thank all of you for joining us. We'll have episode number 41 next week. I don't know if my dad will be as excited about the number 41. Yeah. Is that a biblical number, Pastor Mike? You have any number?
Obviously, I didn't. 41? It took me a while to figure out 40, but
we really do appreciate all of you joining us. Crystal and Teresa, we're sorry that we still don't have a daily podcast, but I think most people are appreciating the weekly one. That would be a lot of us.
That would.
A daily podcast.
That'd be too much of us, in my opinion. Maybe we could involve some of the others.
I think we would need to for both us and everybody else. But maybe one day we'll get there. But for now, our new episodes go up every single Monday. Up until this point, I think they've always dove, other than maybe 1 week, they've always dove deeper into the weekend teaching. And that's a big part of the heart of this podcast, is it's a way to continue to grow during the week. We say it every week here, but growth always starts with the next step. And so your first next step might have been listening to this podcast. There's always another next step. So that next step would be to do that homework, go through those questions, check on if your heart might be growing hard this week. And then make sure you're with us this next weekend for our weekend teaching. It'll be the last week, assuming you're listening to this soon, the last week of our My Story Matters series, which I have loved. And then hang out with us for Easter, because it's going to be a great time. Weekend. So we love all of you. We're so thankful for you. And we will see you next week.